How do you get cybersecurity buy-in from the board? We'll talk to an expert on this episode of Safe Mode. Welcome to Safe Mode. I'm Greg Otto, editor-in-chief at Cyberscoop. Every week, we break down the most pressing security issues in technology, providing you the knowledge and the tools to stay ahead of the latest threats, while also taking you behind the scenes of the biggest stories in cybersecurity.
An attack is coming.
It's about keeping us safe.
He's just a disgruntled hacker.
She's a super hacker.
Stay alert.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
This is Safe Mode. Welcome to this episode of Safe Mode. I am your host, Greg Otto. In this episode, we're going to be talking to Dave DeWalt, the co-founder and CEO of NightDragon, also a Cyberscoop 50 winner this year. Check that list out if you haven't yet. Dave has been an expert in cybersecurity in all parameters for decades now. And we sat down with Dave at Black Hat to talk about what it's like to be a board member and get the rest of the board to buy into cybersecurity. So good interview coming up on the back half of this podcast. But first, talking with Derek Johnson, reporter for Cyberscoop, election security expert. And Derek, in the year 2025, we had talked early on that this year is probably going to be quiet on election security. And boy, were we wrong. Very, very wrong, including this week. An interesting week in the world of election security. Let's dive in. What happened?
Yeah, well, so we're still sorting through what happened, but what we know now is that the president of the United States put out a post on his Truth social media site, essentially saying that he was going to lead a movement to ban mail-in voting as well as electronic voting machines. No real details given as to,
and not just a movement. It was like I'm writing an executive order.
So he said part of that is going to be an executive order that he's going to write to address these things. The problem is that there are really no authorities that the executive branch has over elections or this process. There are a few things that I think he could do if he wanted to push the envelope, but we won't know what he's actually getting at until we see an actual EO document come out.
Right. So I think what's good for listeners to understand is let's kind of briefly walk. I know we could talk about this for like 2.5 hours, but let's briefly walk through all of the ways that this can't happen just because of the way that elections are set up in America. Even though the federal government, we have Congress and everybody gets elected and all of that. But the states are really responsible for administering elections and don't take rules or regulations or laws based on what the federal government says. And this has been in the Constitution since the inception of America. We're not dealing with, this isn't like the Chevron ruling or anything like that, where we're dealing with something that has been contained to the past 30 years. This has been something that has been in the bylaws of our country since its birth.
Correct. So I made a crack in my TikTok style video that, that the Constitution's, it's only 4 pages, go read it. But the section that we're talking about here is literally one sentence, which is representatives and senators, the times, manner, and place of those elections get set by the states, but Congress can alter those regulations when they want. That's it. That's all it says. As you can imagine, the executive branch isn't mentioned at all. And so, Trump, it sort of floated out this thing, this sort of rhetorical tactic that he does a lot, which is he'll say something that is not, that is absolutely novel in terms of an interpretation, but he'll present it as this, as everyone knows.
People are saying.
Yeah.
Right.
So here he says, I thought that what we let off in our coverage and what I thought was relatively important in this long post is, essentially he said, remember, the states are merely an agent of the federal government when it comes to counting and tabulating the votes, which is something that is just 100% not true. And there's no credible theory as to how that ever would be true. But it's putting it out there that he views the relationship between him and the states when it comes to elections as the federal government being the one who sets the agenda and the states being the one that carry it out. So I thought that was the more interesting thing, because he has all these levers with the federal government that he can use to work with either cooperative states or uncooperative states to get that agenda put in place, I think.
So of the people that you talked to, did they just kind of throw their hands up and say, devoid of any information other than this tweet or post or whatever? It's hard to say, but for all intents and purposes, like, even if there is some order that comes down, it's going to be ultimately challenged in the courts at some point, right?
Yeah, it will be. And then the Trump administration has already put out an executive order on elections that was largely or partially rolled back by the courts, including, trying to use the Bipartisan Election Assistance Commission, trying to basically get them to change their voter registration request forms that states request to include proof of citizenship, and deny those forms to states that didn't provide that information. And that got pulled back. But you can see, the Election Assistance Commission is also the agency that is in charge of testing voting machines and certifying voting machines. So you could potentially see something there with the Trump administration potentially trying to change the guidelines or change the requirements so that you do have voting machines that we're using in elections in 2026 or 2028 that are technically out of compliance with federal regulations. And so what does that do to ongoing legal battles? What does that do to other fights that we're seeing around voter registration? I think that's the questions here.
So let's give a quick update too, because I know you've been following the noise around the SAVE Act and the lawsuits from the DOJ to the states there. Has there been any real progress on that, or are those fights still being waged?
So you're seeing, obviously, Republican-friendly states and Republican-controlled states like Georgia and I believe Ohio and some others that are cooperating with the federal government, cooperating with USCIS, passing along the information that they're requiring. You also have states like Minnesota, states like California, states, I believe Maine is another one that have, flat out said, no, we're not turning this data over. We don't know what you're going to do with it. There's no real legal authority for you to request it. And it would put our citizens' private information at risk. So, that being said, I think just with the voluntary stuff that they're able to get from states that are willing to cooperate, that there's certainly a lot and there's been a lot that's been done on the federal side to merge different databases and things like that. So altogether, I think that they are moving along in their quest to create this sort of massive citizenship checking system of dubious accuracy, but they're certainly moving along.
Okay, so all of this is sort of operating on this idea within the administration that there is rampant voter fraud, and there has been rampant voter fraud in the past elections. We've said time and time again in the pages of Cyberscoop. It has been reported time and time again in other publications. Take your pick out there that is just not the case. And the reason I bring that up is because on the same day that Trump put out this message, there was a court ruling against Newsmax that had to do with voter fraud and the voter machines being hacked and all of that. And I'll let you take it away, because I thought it was how coincidental that this rolls out at the same time that the president says we need to be looking at this.
It was very interesting that got put out there on the same day. I'm not sure Newsmax could have done the president a solid and maybe he waited a day or two to announce that. Listen, it's not the first time Newsmax was sued over lies in the 2020 election and claiming that voting machines were rigged from Dominion and Smartmatic. They were, it's not the first time that they were sued. It's not the first time that they lost. They're not the first conservative news organization that lost. And that was sort of the point that some of the lawyers that I talked to pointed out, which is there is this enduring belief that gets put forward by Trump world that sort of this question about whether the voting machines were rigged has sort of never really fully been adjudicated, that a lot of these cases in 2020 were thrown out on lack of standing grounds or that's sort of the argument that you see. But in reality, every time that the president's allies and friendly news organizations like Fox News, like Newsmax, like Carrie Lake, like Rudy Giuliani, every time that they have been in court and given an opportunity to prove their case, they have failed. They failed to persuade. And that's because their evidence isn't persuasive. And so, I think it was very ironic, but I also think that this is a story that is as much about reality as it is about what the person in charge of the executive branch, how they're going to wield it in response to what they perceive as reality. Right. So,
right. Just want to clarify that I said it was a ruling against Newsmax. That was not the case. I realized that once I said that it was actually just Newsmax settled because they said they didn't think that the court was going to be fair against them. And that was not the case. It was just in terms of, I don't think, like you said, the argument wasn't very persuasive.
Yeah, as I said in the story, they would have proved that the election was rigged if the lawsuit wasn't rigged against them.
Right.
And that's sort of their argument. So.
Well, like I said at the beginning, it's been a very interesting time for election security. You can read all about it on cyberscoop.com. And that byline, I would say 100 times out of 100 is going to be from Derek Johnson. I'm sure he will be keeping up on this and look forward to having you on the program to discuss it as it unfolds.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joining us now in our interview segment is Dave DeWalt, the CEO and co-founder of NightDragon. We talked to Dave out at Black Hat this year. Really interesting time for Dave. Dave, among the many other things that he does, I know that he is well involved in the public sector and private sector. Dave also is on cybersecurity boards. He's on the board of Delta Airlines, and he's also on the board, recently appointed to the board of Exelon, the power company on the East Coast of America. Talk to Dave about conversations at the board level when it comes to cybersecurity. I mean, if you talk to anybody that cares about enterprise cybersecurity, they're always talking about what you need to do to get the board aligned with what needs to happen inside an enterprise when it comes to cybersecurity. So we had a really nice conversation about all of the experience that he has in getting boards to understand what is needed with cybersecurity, what is needed for conversations with cyber risk, what is needed with tabletop exercises when it comes to cybersecurity. And all that really goes into what needs to happen at a real decision-making level when it comes to securing an enterprise with cybersecurity. Check it out. All right, joining us this week on our Safe Mode interview segment, we're out here at Black Hat, and I'm talking with one of the foremost experts in cybersecurity, Dave DeWalt, the founder and CEO of NightDragon Investments. Dave has been around in both the government space and the private sector space when it comes to cybersecurity, and he's actually just joined the board of power company Exelon, and wanted to talk with Dave about what it's like being on the board and talking about cybersecurity. We've been talking for decades about boards and executives needing to know the most about cybersecurity. So I have a board member with a cybersecurity background right here talking about his experience. So Dave, thanks for joining us.
Greg, thanks for having me. First of all, it's great to be here at Black Hat for what could be like the 15th year in a row. I'm not sure how many years I've been here, but I feel like the OG. Everybody keeps calling me OG, and I keep saying it's NG for like the new gangster. So
okay.
I'm feeling like I got to refresh that. But no, it's wonderful to be here and see the whole community again, and so much happening. And to your point, I've had now almost 25 years in the cyber and national security markets, and the juxtaposition of all the threats and risks, and now AI and quantum and agentic, and the world in a very interesting geopolitical state makes every year here at Black Hat quite interesting. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So with talking about cybersecurity to a board, given your expertise, what have those conversations been like? Because we've heard for so long that executives aren't going to know the ins and outs from a technical standpoint of what needs to be done from a cybersecurity perspective. Like, just for instance, I do this all the time when I am talking to my reporters about translating the technical jargon for people to read quote unquote normal. Like, for instance, I just talked to a reporter about, he used in the phrase, what was it? Persistent access and technical infrastructure. And I pulled him around. I was like, you and I understand what that means, and that's fine. But take it from the perspective of somebody that isn't in this world all the time, that needs to understand what that means. And I would imagine that talking to executives and talking to board members, that happens a lot too, where it's like persistent access, like microservices or zero trust. Like what are you talking about? So I'm wondering, what are the conversations like, and what have you found that has really helped executives and board levels get their arms and hands around what it needs to take for their enterprises to really understand what needs to happen from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question, Greg. And we, first of all, I'd just say we've come a long way after, 15, 20 years of talking to boards. I've been in hundreds of boardrooms explaining to people why they got breached or what they have to do, post breach with the remediation process. And for many years, it was a little bit of shock and anger and like, how did this happen to us? And you almost blaming everybody but themselves for the problem. And the distance we've come has been remarkable, but I'd also say the distance we have to go is remarkable as well. There's a lot more education at the board level. Almost every board has some sort of annual or quarterly update by their chief security officers. But when we did our study, it was remarkable to see how little time they still spend on this. So the average board spends less than 1 hour all total for an entire year on their cyber problems. Average of the Fortune 500.
Yeah, that's not going to cut it.
So if you spend 1 hour on this problem and you're getting breached on a regular basis, you think you're spending enough time on it. So the answer is no. The other part is how many actually have a cyber expert on the board? And you compare that to how many have an accounting expert on the board, and you go, everybody has an accounting expert on the board, and less than 5% have a cyber expert on the board. So 95% of the Fortune 500 do not have a cyber expert on the board, yet we have one of the biggest risks in the world being cyber breaches and threats and ransomware activities. So, not only do we have an education problem we have to close the gap on, we have an experience and expertise problem we have to put on the boards. And it's become a risk at the board that's substantial as a result of all the threats and things that are happening. So why am I on some of these critical infrastructure boards? Because some of them have some of the biggest threats, biggest risks, but also biggest opportunities as well. And one more minute on that. The reason I joined Exelon's board, it's the largest energy delivery company in America. They own most of the utilities and the smart grids, is because there was a lot of threats of cyber attacks, most notably Volt Typhoon. And Volt Typhoon kind of rattled a lot of people. Chinese actor coming into the utility industry, potentially bringing down grids and really getting a deep penetration into those markets. But then we also saw that AI and data centers meet the grid is a national security problem as well. And we have demands 3 times the amount of capacity than we can deliver today. So the data centers need that energy. America needs to generate that energy. We need to deliver that energy. And we can't let these data centers, hyperscalers, and AI platforms move to the Middle East or Asia. We need them here in America. So a lot of my role here is to help with technology, with security, and now the crossroads of these markets are never been greater. So cyber has become a mainstream in energy as well.
Right. So with that, when you are talking to boards, what metrics do you believe are most meaningful when evaluating a company's cybersecurity experts, especially when you are talking to non-technical teams? Like, what are the metrics that you use to get across whether a company is doing a good enough job when it comes to their cybersecurity profile?
Yeah, you think about what boards look at. I mean, the first thing they look at is governance of cyber. Where does the governance of cyber need to sit? Typically, it's an audit or a risk committee. Sometimes it's in a safety or security committee as well, but mostly an audit. And in audit, there's what they call ERM dashboards or enterprise risk management dashboards. The first question I ask the board, where is cybersecurity in your ERM? And are you tracking actual remediations of the risk by quantifying cost and risk of a breach that might occur? Do you understand all that? And then are you tracking that? And then I try to put it into simpler terms. When Sarbanes-Oxley came out a long time ago around the accounting industry, everybody had a wake-up call. And now we all know what SOX 404, 302 is. We know what a significant deficiency is, material weakness is. There's hardly a boardroom out there that doesn't know what an MW and an SD is. But if you put it in terms of cybersecurity, do you have an MW? Do you have an SD? What are your risks and deficiencies and material weaknesses? Put it into risk formats that you can track with KPIs is really key. Now, there's a lot of standards like NIST that you can monitor, ISO standards as well. And so a lot of companies do it differently. We need a uniform standard for tracking this, just like the accounting industry did. I believe we need that for cyber too.
So what else in terms of like structures and incentives do you feel has helped foster like a community-wide and a company-wide sense that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility instead of just going,
okay, the CISO's got it. Like, we'll talk to the CISO when we need to talk to the CISO. What do you think needs to happen in order to make it really a company-wide effort as companies continue to grow, especially in the dynamic threat environment like we talked about?
Well, you just hit on a key word there. Cyber is a team sport, I always say, right? It takes a village to solve these problems. Public partnerships with the private industry, public-private partnerships, really critical. How does the government partner with the private sector? The private sector being public companies as well as private companies, but threat sharing, intelligence sharing, the speed to intelligence sharing really matters. So if there's victim 1, we can't let victim 2, 3, and 100 happen. So we have to share intelligence awful quickly in order to be good at this. But we also need private and private sharing as well. So if one company in the airline industry or the energy industry is breached, how do they share with all the other energy or airline industry companies quickly as well? And that's where cyber is really good. People do share and they do work together and they do know each other. You can just see it here at Black Hat, everybody coming together. But we got to take it to another level because now we got to work internationally together. And we got to, this is a global team sport as well. And I think we got to do a lot more in that global area than we do today.
So what other metrics do you believe are most meaningful when evaluating the mitigation efforts? Like, I always wonder how companies deal with this because, look, every IT system is its own little special snowflake. So I'm wondering, are there any leaders outside of IT that you tell executives to lean on besides the CISO when it comes to really shoring up a cybersecurity profile inside a company?
Yeah, you bet. I boil it down to 2 things many times when I'm talking to boards and to CEOs. It's response and resiliency. So on the response side, how fast can I respond to an indicator of compromise? So if I see an IOC, how fast can I respond to mitigate that IOC? If you can't respond fast, your risk goes up. Pretty easy. So let's test that. And then the second part of the response side is how fast can I respond to a CVE or a vulnerability that's in the wild as an exploit? Maybe I haven't seen an indicator of compromise, but my neighbor has. How fast can I patch that network? So response matters huge in measuring metrics. The faster you respond, the less risk you have. The other area is resiliency. So what are we watching in resiliency areas? Ransomware attacks. Outages by the security vendors or the IT vendors. CrowdStrike makes a mistake, brings down thousands and thousands of companies. How fast could you respond to an outage of your own vendors? That's called vendor resiliency and operation resiliency. Right. So recovery time really matters as well, not just response time. You got to really understand how to recover, be resilient as well. So I try to boil it down to those 2 R's and what KPIs can a board track on both resiliency and recoverability. And that really is a determination of your risk, the 3rd R.
How do you feel about involving boards in tabletop exercises? Because I know that when tabletop exercises are talked about, it's really just sort of a CISO and the IT team testing their resiliency plans. But I'm wondering your feelings on involving the board in that process. Because like you just said, a lot of boards only spent an hour on this. And I feel like maybe even if that hour was spent just doing a tabletop exercise just to educate them on, oh, this is how all of this would play out, that would be beneficial. So I'm wondering, what are your feelings on involving the board in tabletop exercises if they have the time to do so?
I highly encourage it. And most of the companies I'm involved with do have some sort of, crisis planning exercise. It does involve the board and the management team and the whole company, but they do it once a year. Once a year is a little long in the cyber world. They could do it a little bit more often. But having said that, you hit another keyword, education. We've got to up the level. So every year, directors and officers have to take a questionnaire, and they have that questionnaire in order to stay valid as a board member by the SEC and the ISS and the proxy management firms. Part of the questionnaire was, what kind of cyber training and education did you get this year? Did you have a couple hours of it? What is the minimum amount we should have? It's almost like accounting. If you're on a board, we expect you to understand how income statements work, balance sheets work, cash flow statements work. I expect you to understand a certain level of cyber and security risk to be a board member. And in order to do that, you should have some accreditation you should be responsible for. I'm not asking you to take 10 hours a month in a course and a PhD.
Right. We don't need a CISO.
Right, but we need a basic knowledge level. So when we're talking the words like IOCs and CVEs and APTs, you at least kind of generally know what they are. And then your education's high enough to partake in these once-a-year programs. So I think there's a little education and communication and exercise that need to get done.
So with your experience on the boards that you sit on, I'm wondering, what are the unique cyber risks or regulatory considerations that you've worked into your position, and how do they influence board discussions?
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory side is industry by industry, of course. So everybody has some sort of SRMA, that, some sector regulatory management agency that governs you. They're all different. Unfortunately, there's 16 SRMAs.
Right.
And every industry does the governance a little different from cyber. And that's just in the United States. So if you look at globally from a regulatory process and you're doing business in 100 countries, most companies have over 200 regulations in cyber and privacy they have to adhere to. So how hard is it for a CISO who has 200 regulations they got to manage as a public company doing business globally? That's way too many.
Right, especially because you're trying to make your IT system fit into all of those, like whether it's, and that's just from an infrastructure perspective.
And shouldn't we be worried about risk and breach more than we are regulation adherence and compliance in the world of cyber, especially with critical infrastructure? So we have way too much regulation, in my opinion, not enough conformity and unity around that. And we've got to get better at both of that. Now, watching the inertia of the U.S. and its allies trying to come up with better standards for this is good. We have a long way to go.
So on the critical infrastructure side, with the Volt Typhoon side of things, I'm wondering, with what you can speak to, how have those conversations gone? Because you said it really threw everybody for a loop when the details of that has come out. So I'm wondering, what has the response been like to that? What have the conversations been like? And how have things changed in terms of resiliency and focusing on making sure that the threat doesn't go past what we already know?
Yeah, Greg. Well, first of all, there's 4 typhoons. So a lot of people don't understand it's like 4 hurricanes.
Oh, I know all the typhoons.
You know, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So when we first saw Volt Typhoon, it was a serious wake-up call because everybody was a little shocked at the reasons why we had Volt Typhoon. A lot of the wargaming China did to really kind of threaten from a Taiwan point of view, to really make America understand that it was very vulnerable. So tread lightly when having your rhetoric in the global markets. And we started to realize, wow, here was Volt Typhoon, not stealing IP, not doing anything from a crime point of view, but creating a warning. And that warning was heard loud. And as people understood Volt Typhoon, we really understood like how vulnerable our critical infrastructure in energy actually is. Then Salt Typhoon comes along and brings down our telecommunication companies, 8 major telcos, all in the United States, all with outages, with a significant vulnerability in a firewall vendor named Fortinet. Why do we have a vulnerability 0-day, and how many 0 days have we had in Fortinet? So you got to ask yourself, what is Fortinet doing to basically secure itself?
Right.
That kind of pisses you off too, right there, because we trust a vendor like that. And they were able to bring down our telecommunications infrastructure. And you go one typhoon after another. And after a while, for somebody who's been in this a long time, you're pissed off. Because what is China doing to America in a way that is waking us all up to the risk related to China affecting critical infrastructure of energy and utilities? And then you had the SAP one that occurred that we had a big to-do about.
Yep, we covered that too. Yep.
And we watched all the tariff management. And suddenly China was very effectuating attacks on learning about bill of materials in the supply chain to come up with trade and tariffs. So you see a very aggressive attacker in China through these typhoons. And a lot of the America's boards, I don't know, clicked in on this yet. And again, it's an education and awareness thing that really needs to elevate.
Great. Dave, really appreciate your time. Appreciate you giving us a view of some of your expertise, because I know you've seen so much. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us.
Always. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Safe Mode, a weekly podcast on cybersecurity and digital privacy brought to you by Cyberscoop. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and a review and share it with your friends, your coworkers, your CISOs, your sysadmins, your mom, your dad, anybody that wants to know more about cybersecurity. To find out more information or to contact me, please look for all of our social media handles or visit cyberscoop.com. Thanks for listening. Check us out next week.